So the holidays are coming and you want to buy yourself an iPad. You don't want the iPad mini because it's too small, so your choice is between the iPad Air 2 and the iPad Pro. Well, welcome to our video of the iPad Pro versus iPad Air 2, and hopefully you'll walk away from this video with a few That's What She Said jokes and perhaps an answer to your first world problem. The iPad Pro and the iPad Air 2 are the two most powerful iOS devices you can buy, but one of these has basically double the performance of the other. Care to guess which one? Yeah, it's the Pro. Build-wise, these two are identical. They both share the same design language, though one is super duper sized, but fundamentally they are slabs of aluminum filled with batteries, flash memory, and a small motherboard containing the components to make up an iOS device. They both house an 8 megapixel camera on the back, but yeah, remember what I said about people taking photos of tablets? Just don't do it. Internally, the story is pretty different. The iPad Air 2 is packed with a triple-core A8X processor clocked in at 1.5 GHz. It's seated next to 2 GB of RAM and the M8 Motion coprocessor. The iPad Pro is basically the same, but just way more. It's a dual-core unit, though it's clocked in at a mega 2.3 GHz. It has double the RAM at 4 GB and has the M9 Motion coprocessor. This makes for a really interesting story for the benchmarks. So basically, the iPad Pro kicks the iPad Air's butt bad. Size-wise, well, let's start with this. You can fit two vertically sitting iPad Airs on one horizontally sitting iPad Pro. iPad Air 2 comes in at 9.45 inches tall, 6.67 inches wide, and 6.1 millimeters thick. It's actually still the thinnest iPad around. Though if you want size, the iPad Pro comes in at 12.04 inches tall, 8.69 inches wide, and 6.9 millimeters thick. Screen real estate wise, the iPad Pro has 78% more display to offer, but thankfully the display is packed with way more pixels than the iPad Air 2. The iPad Air 2 has a resolution of 2048 by 1536 packed into a 9.7 inch display. Its pixels per inch is rated at 264. The Apple MacBook with its 12-inch Retina display has a resolution of 2304 by 1440. And while the 15-inch MacBook Pro Retina has more horizontal pixels than the iPad Pro at 2,800, its vertical pixels is only rated at 1,800. So that means the iPad Pro, with an outstanding resolution of 2,732 by 2,048, is the most pixel-packed mobile product Apple sells right now, with more than 5.5 million total pixels packed into one display. That all means the iPad Pro has one of the most beautiful displays you can find right now. It's actually a pure pleasure to use the panel on this thing. Even though it's huge and very unmanageable to hold, the panel just makes content spring into life. Now, that's not saying the panel on the iPad Air 2 is bad, because pixel density-wise, they are exactly the same at 264 ppi. Though one thing that I must say is iOS looks more at home on the iPad Air 2 than the iPad Pro. Just looking at the spacing differences, it's kind of comical, hilarious even. iOS 9 is not well suited for something with a Pro badge, especially if you buy the iPad Pro as a standalone product. You really do need the Apple keyboard and the Apple Pencil to truly tap into its potential, but unfortunately you have to cough up an extra $270 to get both of those. And in the real world, the iPad Air 2 will suit you just fine for content consumption and as a standalone product. It's small enough and more importantly light enough to be used handheld, yet its near 10-inch display is large enough to provide you a great content consumption experience. You can still tap into the power of multitasking, but throughout using these two side by side, one thing became very clear. When you add real performance to an iOS device, you no longer have those weird and strange lags that pop up here and there. The iPad Pro is the best showcase of what real power and simple software means when they're put together. It's the smoothest iOS device I've ever used. And like I said with the display of the iPad Air 2 and the iPad Pro, the iPad Air 2 is definitely no slouch when it comes to performance. It's one powerful device on its own, but the hardware is now over a year old and it's likely going to be a 2-year product. So if you're trying to decide between these two, you first have to ask yourself, what are you really using your iPad for? If you're going to be on the go and don't want to deal with large keyboards, a large size of an iPad, and you want to use your iPad as a standalone media consumption device, then the iPad Air 2 is definitely the product to go for. If you want to use an iPad as a home media consumption device, or you're a student used to carrying around heavy laptops and does nothing more than typing up notes in class, playing games during breaks, and watches Netflix all the time, and don't mind carrying a 1.5-pound tablet, then the iPad Pro may be for you. Now notice I never mentioned anything about people who actually want to fully work. Why? Because it's a freaking iPad. It runs iOS, and you'll never match the power of a Mac or something else running a full-blown version of good software. So if you really do want a portable, powerful machine to do real work on, then perhaps a MacBook or a Windows notebook might be the best thing for you to get. So do you really need the iPad Pro? No, you definitely don't need one, though it is mighty nice to use one. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video on the iPad Pro and the iPad Air. Make sure to leave your questions and comments and jokes below, and as always, my name is Marco Hanna, and I'll catch you in the next video.